Here is the thing about Harper Elizabeth Donovan that you need to understand right from the start. She was not impulsive. That is a critical point, because everything about what she did on that particular Friday night in January looked like the behavior of a woman who was indeed impulsive. But she wasn't. She was, in fact, the most practical person she knew. She kept a first aid kit in her car. She always arrived at appointments 10 minutes early. She owned a slow cooker and actually used it. She had just never quite figured out how to be practical about people. That, right there, was the whole problem. Harper had been in St. Paul for 4 months, which meant she had been a small-town girl living in a very large city for exactly 4 months, and she was still working out the basic rules. For instance, in Millbrook, Minnesota, population 1,847, home of the world's largest fiberglass loom and a gas station that doubled as the finest dining establishment in a 12-mile radius. If your neighbor's car broke down, you drove them to the mechanic. You brought food when someone was sick. You showed up. That was just the way things worked. St. Paul, she had been quietly informed by her coworker Greta, did not operate on those principles. Greta had actually made a small sound of alarm when Harper mentioned she had helped a stranger carry groceries to her car in the parking garage. You can't just help random people, Greta had said, with the gravity of someone explaining that the sun was, in fact, very hot. This isn't a small town. People still need help with groceries, Harper had said. Harper. Greta had given her the look. The "you are going to get yourself murdered" look. Anyway, the point was, Harper knew the rules, she knew them, she had memorized them, she had practically laminated them. Which made what happened at 2 a.m. on a Friday night in January particularly hard to explain. She had been asleep, deeply, righteously, 8 hours a night asleep, when her work phone buzzed on the nightstand, not her personal phone. Her corporate-issued phone, the one that technically belonged to Mercer Industries and lived in her nightstand because she was responsible like that. It buzzed once. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She squinted at the ceiling in the dark. She picked up the phone. The message was from an unknown number, and it read, "Hey, my cell phone is dead. Using the bartenders. Come get me at Shenanigans. Drank too much? The bar is closing." "Don't let your big brother down." Harper stared at the message. Then she looked at the time. Then she looked out the window, where the temperature gauge her landlord had thoughtfully mounted on the exterior of the building, possibly as a warning, possibly as a punishment, read -14 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was before the wind chill. In January, in St. Paul, the wind chill was its own separate and deeply personal villain. She typed back, "I think you have the wrong number." She waited. No response. Which made sense, because the man had borrowed a bartender's phone, and the bar was closing, and if the bar was closing at 2 in the morning, then everyone was going home, and the bartender's phone was going with them, and there was a man outside Shenanigans. She knew the bar. She knew exactly where it was. She had walked past it 100 times, standing in -14 degrees with a dead phone who had no idea his text had gone to the wrong person. Harper sat up in bed. She did not do this. This was not a thing she did. Greta's voice was in her head right now, very loud and very clear, and Greta was saying things like stranger danger and you don't even have pepper spray. Which was fair. She really didn't have pepper spray. She picked up her personal phone and looked up the news. Nothing about Shenanigans. She looked up the temperature forecast. -18 by 4 a.m. She thought about a news story she had seen 2 winters ago. A man found the next morning, 3 blocks from a bar. The headline had been brief and terrible. "Oh, for the love of corn," she muttered, which was a thing people said in Millbrook when they were frustrated and had been raised not to swear. She got up. She pulled on jeans over her pajama pants because she was not a complete lunatic. She was still going to be warm, and layered a sweatshirt over her sleep shirt and shoved her feet into boots and twisted her hair into the messiest bun in the history of buns. She grabbed her keys, her personal phone, a can of pepper spray she did, in fact, own and had simply forgotten about, and her enormous wool coat that she had bought at a farm supply store in Millbrook, and which Greta had described as looking like you skinned a buffalo. It was warm. Greta could mind her business. She was not going to let some stranger freeze to death outside a bar in January because he texted the wrong number. That was not something she was capable of. She had tried genuinely to be the kind of person who didn't get involved, and she could report with authority, that it was simply not in her. Some people were wired for cities. Harper Donovan was wired for showing up. The drive to Shenanigans took 8 minutes. The parking lot was empty, except for one man sitting on the low concrete wall outside the entrance, hands shoved in the pockets of what Harper could see immediately was not a sufficient coat for this weather. He had his chin tucked and his shoulders up around his ears in that particularly miserable posture of a person who is very cold and very aware of it. Harper pulled up and rolled down the window. The cold hit her in the face like a brick. "Hey," she called. "Did you send a text about 30 minutes ago to the wrong number?" The man looked up, and Harper, who had been braced for just about anything, who had the pepper spray in her coat pocket with her thumb on the cap and a whole plan about keeping the car in drive, was not braced for this. Because the man who looked up from the concrete wall outside Shenanigans at 2 in the morning on the coldest night of the year had sandy brown hair that was doing something interesting in the wind, and the kind of face that could make a woman completely forget she was holding pepper spray. Even drunk. And he was obviously, impressively drunk. She could see that from here. He was unfairly attractive. She was going to have several words with the universe about the timing of this particular development. "My brother didn't come," he said. His voice was deep and a little unsteady, like someone speaking carefully around a word they knew they were mispronouncing. "Your brother doesn't know you texted," Harper said. "You texted me by accident. Wrong number." He considered this for a moment with the gravity of a man working a very difficult math problem. "Huh," he said. "Are you going to get in the car? It's -14. "Are you a serial killer?" he asked, with what could only be described as a wry grin. "Are you going to freeze to death on this wall?" He looked at the wall. He looked at the car. Some internal calculation happened behind his eyes. He stood up, and she noticed he was tall, very tall, the kind of tall that required actual awareness of door frames, and he moved toward the car with the careful dignity of a man who was pretending very hard that the ground was not unsteady beneath him. He got in. The smell of whiskey and expensive cologne settled into her front seat, and Harper put the car in drive and told herself this was fine, totally fine. She was a practical woman. "What's your address?" she asked. He leaned his head back against the seat. "She was using me," he said. Harper waited. "Okay, what's your address?" The whole time, his voice had shifted into the particular register of the profoundly drunk, not maudlin exactly, more like a man narrating a documentary about his own life with mild academic interest. You know what she was doing? She was using me to get information, company information, and I missed it. He turned his head and looked at Harper with those dark brown eyes that were, she noticed, quite beautiful, even when approximately 60% unfocused. "I missed all of it, the little things. I'm supposed to be the one who doesn't miss the little things." "That sounds really frustrating," Harper said, in the tone she had learned meant "please also tell me where you live." "Address?" I wasn't even heartbroken. That's the worst part. You know what I was? I was angry at myself. He paused. He seemed to be finding this a personal revelation. Not at her. At myself. For missing it. "What's your brother's number?" "I haven't even seen my brother in 3 months." 3 months? He held up 3 fingers to confirm this figure. "He lives 15 minutes away. He's my brother." "That's very sad," she said, meaning it. "How about you give me your brother's phone number, and I'm sure he will come get you. Someone in my position can't afford to miss the little things." He seemed to be cycling back to this. "That's what it comes down to." "What is your position exactly?" Harper asked, genuinely curious now because the coat he was wearing, the insufficient one, had the quiet, understated quality of something that had cost more than her first car. But he had closed his eyes. She tried 3 more times for the address. She tried for his brother's number. She tried asking his last name. Each time, he either didn't answer or veered back to the girlfriend. The one who had used him, the one he wasn't even heartbroken about. Or to his brother, or to the general crime of missing the little things. She pulled his phone from his jacket pocket while they were at a red light. Completely dead. Black screen, not even a flicker. Apple phone, no charging cable she owned would fit it. Harper drove and thought about her options. She could take him to a hospital, but there was nothing wrong with him except whiskey. She could call the police, but what was she going to say? "I found him?" She'd found him. She had a drunk man with beautiful eyes and an insufficient coat, and no name and no address and no way to call his brother, and it was minus 14 degrees. She took him home. Of course she did. She took him back to her apartment on Colfax, which had good locks and a doorman named Harold, who had given her a look of profound and professional neutrality as she had helped the man through the lobby. "Evening, Harold," she had said. "Evening, Miss Donovan," Harold had said with the tone of a man who had seen everything and intended to remember nothing. He was conscious enough to make it to the couch under his own steam, barely. She got his boots off. They were excellent boots, the kind with no visible branding that were somehow obviously expensive, which told her a great deal about a person. And his coat, and she shook out her grandmother's afghan, the enormous thick one in cream and gold that Agnes Donovan had spent the better part of 1987 knitting, and which Harper had carried across 2 moves and 1 divorce, because some things you simply did not leave behind. She tucked it around him. He was asleep, or some near cousin to asleep, before she finished. She went to the kitchen. She got a glass of water. She found the aspirin in the cabinet. She put them both on the little table next to the couch because that was the thing you did, and she stood there for one moment looking at this man she didn't know. This large, unfairly attractive, sad about the wrong things man wrapped in her grandmother's afghan, and she had approximately 4 thoughts in rapid succession. 1, she should call someone. 2, she had no one to call. 3, he was probably fine. 4, she was going to be so tired in the morning, she went to bed. She left her own bedroom door locked, because she was practical. And she did not let herself think, not even once, about the way he had looked at her in the car. Those unfocused brown eyes landing on her face with a kind of wondering attention, like she was a thing he hadn't expected to find and wasn't sure what to do with. She did not think about that at all. She thought about it a little.
Loving this story? Please help me to know that I have hit the mark by tapping that like button, and don't miss the next one. Be sure to subscribe.
Consciousness arrived for Declan Reed Mercer the way bad weather arrived in St. Paul, gradually, then all at once, and with a level of personal hostility that felt targeted. The first thing he was aware of was the light. Someone had installed the sun at approximately 6 inches from his left eye, which seemed excessive. The second thing he was aware of was his head, which had apparently been replaced during the night with a much heavier model filled with wet sand. The third thing, and this was the one that made him open both eyes despite the sun situation, was that he had absolutely no idea where he was. He sat up, he was on a couch, a very comfortable couch actually, upholstered in something the color of warm oatmeal, and he was covered in the most substantial blanket he had ever encountered in his life. Thick and soft and cream-colored with gold threading, the kind of thing that felt like it had a history. The apartment around him was small and clean and arranged with a kind of cheerful practicality. A bookshelf crammed past capacity, a kitchen that showed signs of actual use, a window with a view of a gray January sky and the distinct suggestion of falling snow. There were plants on the windowsill, which were alive, which indicated someone who was responsible. There was a framed print above the bookshelf that said, in block letters, "Be where your feet are," which indicated someone who was perhaps also working through something. On the low table next to the couch, there was a glass of water and a bottle of aspirin. Declan looked at these items for a long moment. Someone had known he would need them. Someone had put them there before going to sleep, knowing that when he woke up, a stranger in their home, a man whose name they didn't even know, a man who had apparently been incapable of providing a single useful piece of information the night before, he would wake up to aspirin and water. He opened the aspirin, he shook out 2, he drank the entire glass of water in 4 swallows, and sat with his elbows on his knees and tried to remember. It came back in pieces, the way these things did. Shenanigans. Far too much whiskey consumed with the specific purpose of numbing the particular flavor of anger that came not from being betrayed, but from having been the kind of fool who missed it. Pamela's face when he had confronted her, cool and unapologetic, which had somehow been worse than tears would have been. The text message he thought he had sent to his brother, the one Declan had tried to send from a borrowed phone. The cold. And then a car. Warm. The smell of something faintly floral and clean. A voice. Patient, slightly exasperated, asking him the same questions over and over with the persistence of a woman who was not going to give up, even when it was becoming abundantly clear that the answers weren't coming. An address, a phone number, a last name. He hadn't given her any of those things, had he? He had given her, as far as he could reconstruct it, a fairly detailed account of Pamela's corporate espionage and his own emotional failings, which was not ideal. And he remembered her face. That was the part that came back with unusual clarity for a memory formed through a considerable quantity of single malt. Brown hair, something between messy and deliberately so, the kind of hair that looked like she'd done it in 30 seconds and had no idea it was charming. Blue eyes, very blue. The kind of blue that made you think of the sky in late October when it was clear and cold and precise. She had been looking at him in the car with a combination of concern and bemusement that he had not encountered in recent memory, because the women in his world were generally too polished for bemusement, and concern tended to come with an angle. She had just been genuinely looking out for him. The realization settled over him with the Afghan, warm and a little disorienting. He set the empty water glass down and stood up, carefully, and did a quiet survey of the apartment, still and silent. A closed door off the hallway. Her bedroom, obviously. He looked at the kitchen counter, napkins in a little holder next to the stove. The paper kind, the sort of small domestic detail that said someone had furnished this place with actual intention. He found a pen in a small cup next to the napkins. He thought about what to write. He thought about leaving his number. He thought about that for a longer moment than was probably warranted for a man with a hangover. The city was enormous. She was a stranger. He did not know her name or her number or even which floor of this building he was on. And she didn't know his last name, didn't know the company, didn't know anything, not even his first name, and he had opinions about being betrayed and hadn't seen his brother in 3 months. He wrote, "Thank you, D." He set the pen down and looked at the 2 words for a moment. They were wildly insufficient. He knew that, but he also couldn't write the things that felt more accurate. Couldn't write, "I don't know how you ended up in that parking lot, but I'm glad you did." Couldn't write something about the aspirin and the water and the blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and had clearly been made by someone who loved the person it belonged to. Couldn't write anything that would adequately explain what it meant to wake up a stranger's home and find that the stranger had thought of your headache before they went to sleep. He found his coat and his boots near the door, arranged neatly, laces loosened. Of course they were. He put his boots on, he pulled on his coat. He went to the front door and paused there with his hand on the knob, in a stranger's apartment in a city of 400,000 people, and he thought, the chances of ever finding her again were essentially 0. He checked the lock, turned the bolt, verified the latch, confirmed it would engage behind him. It was the city. You checked locks. He checked it twice. He stepped out into the hallway. He stood there for one more moment than was necessary. Those blue eyes were remarkably specific in his memory for a man who had consumed that much whiskey. Specific and clear, and looking at him like he was someone worth the trouble of driving across a frozen city at 2 a.m. He took the elevator down. He nodded at the doorman in the lobby, who returned the nod with the expressionless professionalism of a man who had definitely seen him come in last night and was choosing not to have an opinion about it. Declan walked out into the January cold, which was brutal and bright and exactly what he deserved, and he told himself, 400,000 people. The city is enormous. He told himself that all the way to the street. He was still thinking about blue eyes when he got in the cab. Tucker Mercer was, objectively, a difficult man to work for. Not because he was unkind or unreasonable, or any of the things that made working for someone genuinely hard. Tucker was, in fact, almost aggressively pleasant. The problem was that pleasant did not always translate to organized. And organized was, technically, the job. When Harper had been hired as his executive assistant 4 months ago, she had walked into an office that operated on a system she could only describe as optimistic chaos. Tucker had a filing system that lived entirely in his head and was apparently based on a logic known only to Tucker. He had standing meetings he hadn't attended in 3 months and had simply stopped mentioning. He had an assistant before Harper who had lasted 11 weeks, and before that one who had lasted 6, and before that one who had, apparently, walked out on a Tuesday without saying goodbye, which Tucker had reported without a trace of self-awareness. What happened to her? Harper had asked during her first week, looking at the third-generation chaos she had inherited. Oh, Laura, she said something about her blood pressure. Tucker had looked genuinely puzzled. I don't think I contributed to that. Harper had looked at his calendar, which had 12 overlapping appointments on a Thursday, 3 of which were in different cities. Right, she had said. But here was the thing about Tucker Mercer. He was also, under the organizational disaster, genuinely good. He was funny in the specific way of someone who had no idea how funny they were. He noticed when Harper came in looking tired and ordered lunch without asking. He had walked into the middle of a tense phone call she was on with a vendor who had been overtly condescending, had listened for 30 seconds, had taken the phone from her hand and resolved the situation in under 2 minutes, with a cheerful directness that had left the vendor sounding like a man who deeply regretted his life choices. He had handed the phone back and said, "Those guys are always like that, just so you know. You handled it well," and gone back into his office. She had been working for him for 3 weeks at that point. She had gone home that night and thought about it more than she'd like to admit. By month 4, she had his calendar under control, his filing system replaced with something that existed outside the interior of his skull, and his standing meetings either attended or officially canceled. She had also learned that his coffee order was important to him on a spiritual level, and that he was deeply, personally invested in the success of the Minnesota Wild, which had led to a Monday morning debrief that was technically her job, but also sometimes felt like grief counseling. It was, all in all, a good situation. It was a fresh start. That was what St. Paul was supposed to be, a fresh start, a new version of herself, a Harper Donovan, who had left the wreckage of a marriage in a small town behind and built something new in a city where no one knew her name or her story or the particular flavor of quiet humiliation that came from staying in a relationship long past the point when she should have known better. She had known, to be fair to herself, she had always known. That was the thing about noticing things, and Harper noticed things, always had, the small shifts in people's energy and tone, the way a room changed when someone walked in carrying a feeling they hadn't named yet. She had noticed Kevin checking out of their marriage years before he'd left it, had noticed the slight cooling, the ways he'd stopped telling her things, the way he'd started holding his phone at an angle when she walked past. She had noticed all of it, and she had convinced herself, month after month, that she was misreading it. She had not been misreading it. The divorce itself had been civil and quiet and deeply unspectacular, which was almost worse than drama would have been. At least drama would have given her something to be angry at. What she'd gotten instead was a man who had been kind and slightly guilty and had said, with what she understood was genuine regret, "I just don't think you need me, Harper. I don't think you've ever needed me, and I needed to be needed." She had thought about that sentence approximately 400 times since. She still hadn't figured out if it was true. What she knew was this. She kept people at the precise distance where she could care about them without handing them the ability to hollow her out. Tucker, bless him, had ended up inside that perimeter almost by accident. He was too oblivious to notice the distance and too genuinely warm to respect it, and somewhere around week 6 she had given up maintaining it with him. With everyone else, she was pleasant and competent and warmly professional and completely self-sufficient. It was a very good system. She was also, if she was being honest with herself, and she tried to be, because what was the alternative, still thinking, periodically, about a napkin that said, "Thank you, D," in handwriting that was unexpectedly careful for someone who had gone to bed very drunk. She'd found it when she'd woken up that Saturday morning, carried her empty water glass back to the kitchen, and found the napkin weighted down under the aspirin bottle. She'd stood there in her pajamas reading 2 words and had felt, inexplicably, something. Not a lot of something. A small something. The size of a question she hadn't asked. She had thrown the napkin away. Obviously. She was not the kind of woman who kept napkins. The napkin was in the drawer of her nightstand. She checked on it, occasionally, the way you checked on a thing you were definitely going to throw away eventually. It had been 3 weeks. She did not know his name. She did not know his address. She knew he had a brother and an ex-girlfriend with no conscience, and a very strong opinion about missing the little things. She knew he had brown eyes that were, even drunk, the most alert and focused eyes she'd encountered in recent memory. The city was enormous. She was never going to see him again. This was fine. It started with Tucker standing in Harper's office doorway on a Thursday morning, looking the way he always looked when he was about to ask her to do something that would require rearranging her entire afternoon. "How do you feel about Thursday afternoons?" he said. "I have no strong feelings about Thursday afternoons," Harper said, not looking up from her monitor. Wonderful. Block out 2 hours for me. This afternoon? My brother's in town, he's coming by. He said it with the particular mixture of affection and long-suffering resignation that she had come to associate with his references to this brother. Not that he talked about him much, occasionally, and always with that same undertone, like a man who loved someone and found them fundamentally exhausting and would never in his life admit to either feeling. He said he's been meaning to do this for weeks. His name is Declan, right? She said, because she was thorough and she liked to know who was coming through the door. She had read enough of Tucker's correspondence to know the older brother's name. Declan Mercer, President of International Operations, the brother Tucker clearly both admired and found slightly impossible. That's him, Tucker said. He'll probably want coffee. He takes it black, which should tell you everything you need to know about him as a person. I'll add it to my notes, Harper said. Tucker disappeared back into his office. Harper updated the calendar and ordered in the good coffee, the kind from the place 2 blocks over, not the office pot, because Tucker's brother was the president of the parent company, and details mattered. She had approximately 0 premonition about what was about to walk through the door. That was the part she would think about later. No warning, no little shiver of intuition. Just Thursday afternoon, a cleared calendar, and the good coffee cooling slightly in the cup on her desk. The elevator dinged. She heard the doors open and footsteps in the hallway, and she glanced up from her monitor in the standard professional way of a receptionist acknowledging an arrival, and for one single suspended second she saw him. Tall, very tall, sandy brown hair, expensive coat, moving through the hallway with the particular unhurried authority of a man who was used to rooms arranging themselves around him, and something lurched in her chest. Not recognition exactly, more like the feeling of a word on the tip of your tongue, the certainty that you knew something you couldn't quite access. He saw her at the same moment. Declan Mercer stopped walking. It was a very small stop, barely a half beat, the kind of pause that could have been anything, a man collecting his thoughts, checking his phone, noticing the coffee. Anyone else would have missed it entirely. Harper noticed it. She noticed the way his expression did something fast and complicated, and then composed itself, in the span of approximately 1 second, into the smoothest professional neutrality she had ever witnessed. It was, she thought vaguely, impressive, like watching someone catch a glass before it hit the floor and then set it down on the counter with perfect calm, as though the near miss had never happened. He crossed the remaining distance to her desk. Declan Mercer, he said. His voice was, she had not been expecting that voice. It was low and controlled, and there was something under the professionalism that she couldn't name. I'm here to see Tucker. Of course. Harper stood. She always stood when she greeted someone. It was automatic, a Millbrook reflex that she'd never been able to shake in a city that apparently considered this eccentric. Tucker's expecting you. I'm Harper Donovan, his assistant. Can I get you coffee? He was looking at her. Not in any way she could call unprofessional. It was more that the look was thorough, like someone reading a page of text quickly, gathering all available information, committing it to memory. His expression gave away nothing. Brown eyes, very steady. The most controlled face she'd been in proximity to in recent memory, and something behind those eyes that was not controlled at all. Black, please, he said. Tucker mentioned. She was already reaching for the cup of coffee she had waiting for him, mostly because she needed a reason to stop having eye contact with him. She felt off balance in a way she couldn't account for. Something about him tugged at her in a way that was familiar and unidentifiable, like a song you'd heard once in a grocery store and couldn't name. Tucker appeared in his office doorway. Deck, you actually showed up. He was grinning in the specific, delighted way of someone who genuinely wasn't sure the person was going to appear. He crossed the room and did the male, half-hug shoulder grip thing that communicated both affection and the absolute impossibility of saying so, and Declan received it with a warmth that transformed his face so completely that Harper, handing over the coffee, almost dropped the cup. Because that was the face she almost remembered, not the polished president of international operations, the man who had leaned his head back against her car seat and talked about his brother with a grief that had nothing to do with the girlfriend. But here memory simply didn't connect the dots, at least not yet. She handed Declan his coffee. Their fingers didn't touch. He thanked her by name, and she noticed that he had retained it, that he used it, that he did not say thanks or a vague gesture in her direction the way that many of the men who came through Tucker's office did. "We're going to catch up," Tucker told her. "Hold the fort." "Of course." Tucker steered Declan toward his office. Declan walked, and Harper watched. Not watching? She wasn't watching. She was simply facing that direction, and at the office doorway he paused and looked back. He caught her looking. He held it for a half second, those unreadable brown eyes doing the thing she'd already noticed they did, the thing that looked like stillness and wasn't. And then the corner of his mouth moved, barely, just barely, a fraction of a thing, and he went into Tucker's office. Harper sat down. She stared at her monitor. His name was Declan Mercer. He was Tucker's brother. Tucker, her boss. Tucker, who she had known for 4 months. Tucker, who had a brother who lived 15 minutes away and hadn't been seen in 3 months, and who he called once a week, and no, it couldn't be, or could it? This city had 400,000 people in it. She opened Tucker's expense reports. She was very busy. She was extremely occupied. From Tucker's office, she heard laughter. Tucker's first, easy, and immediate, and then underneath it something lower and less frequent that she felt rather than heard. She was definitely throwing that napkin away. Declan came back to Tucker's office 4 times in the next 2 weeks. Harper counted. Not on purpose. She simply had an accurate memory. Each time there was a reason, a document to drop off, a contract to review, a thing that could absolutely have been emailed. Each time he stopped at her desk. Each time the stop lasted longer than document delivery required. He asked her questions about Tucker's schedule, about the quarterly filing she was working on, once about a supplier whose name had come up in conversation. The questions were all legitimate. They were also, she was starting to suspect, not entirely the point. She noticed he always stood at the corner of her desk, not directly in front of it the way most people did. The corner. Which meant he was slightly to her right, and the edge of the desk was not between them. She kept noticing things like this. She found it irritating. The company's social event, a quarterly cocktail hour in the Mercer Industries building 2 blocks over, which the email had described as informal and collegial, and which was neither, happened on a Thursday evening, and Tucker had told her she should come, which meant she was going. Dress code? She had asked. Business casual, whatever that means. Tucker had waved a hand at the concept of dress code, with the dismissiveness of a man who had worn the same navy blazer to every event for 8 years and didn't see the issue. Harper had stood in front of her closet for 25 minutes. This was not like her. She was a woman who made decisions. She owned excellent practical clothing from a combination of her old life and the careful acquisitions of the new one, and she knew what she looked like in all of it. She did not stand in front of her closet for 25 minutes. She wore the dark green wrap dress that she'd bought on a sale rack in October and had not yet found an occasion for. She told herself this was simply logical. The dress existed. An occasion had presented itself. These facts were related in a straightforward and non-significant way. Tucker met her at the elevator with the expression of a man who had just realized his assistant owned clothing outside of business context. "You look nice," he said, with the tone of someone who had meant to deliver a simple compliment and was now hearing how it sounded and was adjusting in real time. "Thank you, Tucker. My brother's going to be here. Bored people. The usual. I'll introduce you around." She had been to exactly 2 events of this kind since moving to St. Paul. The first had been a Chamber of Commerce mixer that she'd attended because Tucker had insisted, and which she had survived by posting herself near the crudities and talking to a very nice woman named Patricia who turned out to be the event planner and was also only there because Tucker had insisted. The second had been a team lunch that was technically a meal but operationally felt like a personality assessment. This was bigger. The Mercer Industries event space occupied the top floor of the building and had the kind of view that made you understand why people wanted to live in cities. St. Paul spread out in every direction below them, the frozen river, a ribbon of pewter in the early evening dark, the lights beginning to come on block by block. Harper stood at the window for approximately 90 seconds before Tucker materialized at her elbow with 2 glasses of sparkling water and the news that she was about to meet the VP of Finance. She met the VP of Finance. She met the Director of Marketing and his wife, and the Director of Human Resources, and a man named Gerald who turned out to be on the board and who shook her hand in the way of a man who was deciding within the first 3 seconds whether she was worth his attention. She did not particularly like Gerald. She had been there 40 minutes and was in the middle of a conversation with two women from the Chicago office about the relative merits of the St. Paul Skyway system. She was pro-Skyway, having discovered the underground walkway network approximately 1 week into her first winter, and having had what could only be described as a spiritual experience when she felt the shift in the room. Not a dramatic shift, just the subtle reorientation of attention that happened when certain people entered a space. She finished her sentence about the Skyway before she turned around. Declan had come in from the far end of the room with two men she didn't know. He was in a dark suit that fit him in the way that made you realize the suits she'd seen him in at the office were also excellent suits. She'd simply been trying not to notice. He was listening to one of the men with a focused attention that looked like the man had his full and complete interest. And Harper had the thought that this was probably how he made everyone feel. That thing of giving your total presence to whoever was speaking. It was the same thing she'd noticed at Tucker's office. He was constitutionally incapable of performing attention. Whatever he paid in full. And then a woman stepped into her eyeline, and Harper's train of thought derailed entirely. She was extraordinary looking. Tall, blonde, in a dress that had been engineered rather than designed, the kind of precision that communicated serious resources and the intention to be noticed. She crossed the room toward Declan with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew what would happen when she arrived, and it did. He turned, and his face did something complicated in a fraction of a second, and then he greeted her with a courtesy that was so technically perfect it told Harper exactly nothing. Tucker appeared at Harper's shoulder. "Oh," he said, "Pamela's here." He said it the way you said "oh" when you'd stepped on something in the dark. "Who's Pamela?" Tucker was quiet for a half-beat too long. "Declan's ex. She knows some board members. She shows up at things." He took a small sip of his drink. "She's very good at showing up at things." Harper watched Pamela Hathaway touch Declan's arm. Watched him not pull away, not because he welcomed it, she somehow knew, but because pulling away would have been a reaction, and he was not going to give her one. Then Pamela turned and looked directly at Harper. It was the kind of look that traveled the full length of a room and landed like a hand on your shoulder. It assessed, calculated, and filed in the time it took for Harper to register it was happening. Then Pamela smiled, bright and warm and perfectly constructed, and moved toward them. "Tucker, darling." She kissed his cheek in the European way that Harper had not yet mastered, and which always made her feel like she'd shown up to a dance and missed the first lesson. "And you must be Tucker's new assistant. I've heard so much about you." This was a lie. Harper could tell it was a lie with the same certainty she could tell when it was going to snow. Something in the air changed quality. She had not been discussed. She had been noticed tonight, and Pamela was now running a very fast calculation. "Harper Donovan," she said. "It's nice to meet you." "Pamela Hathaway?" Another smile, and then a small tilt of the head appraising. "St. Paul must be quite a change." "Tucker mentioned you came from a small town?" "Millbrook, yes." "Oh, lovely." The word lovely did a great deal of work. None of it kind. It must be quite an adjustment, this world. A small, inclusive gesture that took in the room. The view, the suits, the champagne. An adjustment, she meant. "For someone like you." Harper smiled pleasantly. Inside, something went very still and very precise. "I'm adjusting," she said. Across the room, Declan had located them. She didn't look at him. She could simply feel the direction of his attention the way you could feel a heat source without looking at it. "Of course you are." Pamela patted her arm, the pat of a woman who had made a calculation and found it reassuring, and moved smoothly back toward the center of the room. Tucker exhaled next to Harper's ear. "She's terrible," he said, quietly and sincerely. "She's strategic," Harper said, equally quietly. Tucker looked at her. "That's the same thing." "Yes," Harper agreed. "That's the same thing." She looked back out at the city, all that dark and light, and told herself not to notice that Declan was still watching from across the room, and not to think about what that particular quality of attention felt like when it was pointed in her direction. She was working on the not noticing. It needed work. The working dinner was Tucker's idea, which should have been Harper's first warning. He presented it as a practical necessity. A quarterly review that required both the subsidiary operations team and international oversight in the same room, and since Declan was in town through Thursday anyway, and since the Kessler deal required both their sign-offs, and since the restaurant had a private room available and Tucker had already booked it, which was the part that made her narrow her eyes. It simply made sense for Harper to be there, given that she'd been managing the Kessler files for 6 weeks and knew them better than anyone. He delivered this explanation with the breezy confidence of a man who had rehearsed it. "Tucker," she said, "the files, Harper. You know the files. I can brief you on the files. I can write you a summary. I'm terrible with summaries. You know I'm terrible with summaries." This was, unfortunately, true. She went. It was a small, excellent restaurant in Lower Town, the kind where the lighting was warm and low, and the tables were close enough together that you were aware of the room as a whole. The private dining area in the back had 4 chairs and a table set for 3. Tucker had apparently arranged a seating chart, because he steered Harper to the chair with her back to the window and himself to the chair across, which left the 3rd chair directly to Harper's right, close enough that there would be no comfortable geometric middle distance for Declan. Tucker was not subtle. Harper had known this for 4 months. Declan arrived 7 minutes after them, which was not late by any reasonable standard. He had come directly from the office, still in the dark suit, and he came through the door of the private room and did the thing where he scanned the space quickly, table, chairs, seating arrangement, and registered it and sat down without commenting on it. Tucker would have commented on it, most people would have commented on it. Declan simply sat down and shook out his napkin, and when the waiter appeared he thanked him by name after reading his badge, and Harper filed that away with all the other things she was filing. They ordered. Tucker immediately began a story about the Kessler negotiations that required very little input from anyone, which she suspected was by design. Declan leaned back in his chair with his wine and listened to Tucker, but she was aware, in that particular way, she was aware of things that weren't happening in her direct eye line, that some portion of his attention had not moved off her since he'd sat down. Not in an obvious way, just the way a room was aware of weather. "Harper's been managing the Kessler files," Tucker said, executing the handoff smoothly. "She can walk you through the timeline better than I can." She talked about the Kessler files. She was good at this. Clear and organized. The kind of briefing that gave you everything relevant in the right order without wasting time. She watched Declan listen. He asked 2 questions that were good questions, the kind that indicated he'd absorbed everything she said and moved immediately to the next logical implication. He didn't ask things she'd already answered. He didn't look at his phone. "You said the March 15th deadline is firm," he said. "What happens if the Chicago office pushes for an extension?" "They'll push," she said. "The clause is in Section 4. I'd recommend Tucker counteroffer with a modified payment schedule rather than extending the date. Extension precedents complicate the renewal terms," Tucker pointed at her. "See, this is why she comes to dinners." "Tucker," Declan said, with a patience that was the auditory equivalent of slowly putting down a glass, "eat your food." Tucker ate his food. Harper kept her expression professional and did not smile. She was aware, later, that the point at which the dinner became something other than a working dinner was not a dramatic moment. It was gradual, the way the best things were, the way the temperature of a room changed, the way a song became something you were actually listening to instead of just hearing. Tucker had excused himself to take a call, and had been gone long enough that she'd had 3 thoughts about whether he was coming back, and she and Declan were talking. Just talking. And she couldn't have said any more, whether it was about the Kessler deal or something else entirely. She told him something about Millbrook, something small, the fiberglass loon, the gas station that was also a restaurant, the fact that she'd grown up knowing everyone within a 20-mile radius and had not known, until she moved to St. Paul, what it felt like to walk down a street where no one recognized her face. She hadn't meant to tell him that part. It had just arrived. He hadn't said "poor you." He hadn't said, "That sounds lonely." He had looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, "What's the loon for?" And she had laughed, genuinely, out loud, not the professional laugh, and something shifted. The restaurant got louder around 8 o'clock, and he leaned in to hear her over the noise. Just forward, just close, his shoulder angled toward her. She could have moved back. The physics of the chair allowed it. She didn't move back. She was asking him something. She couldn't now reconstruct what, and he answered. and she was close enough to see the exact shade his eyes went in the warm, low light of the restaurant, which was darker than she'd expected, almost amber at the edges, and she was thinking, clearly and unhelpfully, about a drunk man with those same eyes in her car on a January night. Tucker reappeared. Sorry, the Chicago office. He dropped back into his chair with the lack of grace of a man who had absolutely been standing outside that door longer than a phone call required. Where were we? Kessler, Declan said. His voice was even. He had moved back a perfectly ordinary distance. Harper was about to explain the payment schedule modification. She was very professional. Later, outside, the cold was January immediate and sharp as a knife. Her coat was good, she had learned, but the wind off the river at this end of Lower Town was its own creature, and she was pulling her collar up when she felt the weight of something settle across her shoulders. Declan had taken off his overcoat and placed it around her without a word, while she was still dealing with her collar. The coat was heavy and warm, and it smelled like... She was not cataloging the way it smelled. That was not a thing she was doing. You don't have to, she started. My car's around the block, he said. I'm going to be cold for 30 seconds. The tone of it was not a gesture. It was simply a fact being offered. His coat was here. The wind was cold. The conclusion was obvious. Tucker was hailing a cab with the focus of a man who had decided not to be present for this particular moment, which was very interesting because Tucker was usually extremely present for everything. The cab came. Tucker got in it. Harper and Declan stood on the sidewalk. My car's north? She said. I'll walk you. He walked her. He moved to her left automatically, without looking, placing himself between her and the street side of the sidewalk. And she noticed. She couldn't not notice, because it was the kind of thing that happened without announcement and without needing credit. Just a man who walked to the outside of the sidewalk, because that was where he walked. Always. End of story. The coat was still around her shoulders. He had not asked for it back. At her car, she stopped and turned and started to slide the coat off, and he took it, and for a half second, just a half second, his hands were at her shoulders and she was looking up at him, and the St. Paul night was very cold and very quiet around them, and she felt, quite distinctly, the pull. Not attraction, she told herself later. More complicated than that. The specific gravity of someone who had been, 3 weeks ago, a stranger wrapped in her grandmother's afghan, and was now standing here and had not told her. She just hadn't confirmed it yet. She was close, but she hadn't confirmed it. Thank you for dinner, she said. I mean, for the discussion. The Kessler discussion. Yes, he said. That's exactly what that was. She got in her car. She drove 3 blocks and said, out loud to no one, oh no. The problem with working for someone you liked was that they eventually felt comfortable saying things to you. Tucker Mercer, who had been in the professional world long enough to know better, had apparently decided that the professional world's norms about not discussing your brother's personal life with your brother's possible love interest who also happened to be your employee were guidelines rather than rules. He began his campaign on a Wednesday morning, over coffee, with the practiced casualness of a man who had been thinking about this for a while. My brother seems to like you, Tucker said from the doorway of her office, holding his coffee mug with both hands. I'm sure he's perfectly professional, Harper said without looking up. That's not what I said. That's what I heard. Tucker leaned against the doorframe. Has he seemed, I don't know, different to you recently? Different from what? She had known the man for less than 3 weeks. I don't have a baseline for comparison, she said. He used to come by the office maybe once a month. Tucker tilted his head. He's been here 4 times in 2 weeks. Perhaps the Kessler deal has created additional oversight requirements. Perhaps, Tucker said, in the tone of a man who found this explanation very cute. She finally looked up. Tucker, Harper, is there something you want to say? He considered this. Not yet, he decided. I'm still gathering information. That's not reassuring. I know. He pushed off the doorframe. He hasn't been, since the Pamela situation. He's been very locked down. More than usual. And Declan usual is already a lot of lockdown. He paused, seeming to weigh something. She used him. That's not something I'm supposed to tell you, but she used him to get at company information, and he didn't see it coming, and for Declan, not seeing something coming is worse than the thing itself. Harper finished. Tucker looked at her sharply. Yes. How did you know that? She thought about a drunk man in her front seat, with his head back and his voice careful and analytical and deeply, privately wounded. Not about the girl, never about the girl, about his own failure to see. I'm good at people, she said, simply. Tucker studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded, once, slowly, with the air of a man who had filed something very significant. He looks at you, Tucker said. He said it quietly, as though making an official record. He doesn't look at people, Harper. He assesses them. That's what he does. He processes, he evaluates, he decides. He doesn't look. He paused. He looks at you. Harper said, I don't know what you want me to do with that. Nothing yet, Tucker said pleasantly. I'll let you know when I do. He went back to his office. Harper sat in the silence he left behind and told herself that Tucker was a romantic and a meddler, and that his read on his brother was probably filtered through approximately 30 years of fraternal investment and wishful thinking. She also thought about the dinner. About the way Declan had leaned in close, and how neither of them had moved back, and about the coat on her shoulders and the walk to her car and his hands for that half second at her shoulders. He doesn't look at people, he looks at you. She opened the Kessler files, she closed the Kessler files. She got up and refilled Tucker's coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. It happened on a Thursday, and it was entirely accidental. Tucker had a board call that ran long, the way Tucker's board calls always ran long, and by 6:30 the office had emptied out and it was just Harper finishing the quarterly summary and Declan, who had been in Tucker's spare chair all afternoon, working on his own laptop while Tucker's call took up the conference room, who had emerged when Tucker went to the kitchen to refuel and drifted, apparently by force of habit, toward her desk. He sat in Tucker's spare chair, which was beside her desk. He had a file open on his lap. He was not looking at the file. You're always the last one here, he said. Tucker's calls run late. You could leave. He's not going to know. I know, she said. Is there something you need, Declan? The use of his first name, she didn't usually, not in the office, did something small to the air between them. You mentioned you moved from a small town, he said. I mentioned a lot of things. Was that recently? She glanced up. He was looking at her with that direct, careful attention. 4 months ago. Why? Just adjusting my understanding of the timeline, he said, which was a strange thing to say. And she filed it. She went back to the summary. The office was quiet, except for the furnace and the faint sound of Tucker's voice down the hall. Can I ask you something? She said, and wasn't entirely sure why she was asking this now. In this particular quiet. Maybe it was the late hour. Maybe it was Tucker's voice in the other room, and the feeling of not being quite in the professional context, and the way the city lights were coming up in the window behind him, like they did every night around this time. Have you ever done something that was completely impractical? Not reckless, just outside your usual operating parameters, because it was the right thing to do? He was quiet for a moment. Give me some context. About a month ago, she said, still typing, not looking at him. I got a text at 2 a.m. Wrong number. Someone who needed a ride home from a bar. She heard herself tell it the way she had in her head a dozen times. Lightly, as a funny city story, because that's all it was. That's what she decided it was. It was January, -14. I couldn't, not go. The quality of stillness from the chair beside her changed. She hadn't looked at him. She was looking at her monitor. She felt the change without seeing it. Something in the room that was suddenly very concentrated and very quiet. Did you find them? His voice was even, precise. I did. Outside a bar called Shenanigans. A beat. And you brought them, what, home? He couldn't tell me his address. She smiled at the memory without entirely meaning to. He just kept talking. About his ex-girlfriend mostly. About his brother. About missing the little things. She shook her head slightly. I had no idea where to take him, so I took him back to my place. Left him on the couch. Water and aspirin on the table. Very practical. Very, he said. Now she looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was not, she realized, the professional neutrality she had catalogued. It was something more careful than that. something that was working very hard. His jaw was slightly set in the way of a man who was making a decision. "Did he leave?" Declan asked. "In the morning?" "He did, left a note on a napkin." She turned back to her screen. "He didn't even sign his name. Just put his initial, D." She said it lightly, almost lightly. Declan said nothing. She typed 3 more lines of the summary. Deleted one, retyped it. "I've thought about it ever since then," she said, which was more honest than she'd intended, but the evening had gone soft at the edges, and Tucker was still on his call. Not about him specifically, more about, what kind of person does that? He left a note to the complete stranger who rescued him, and on his way out, I could swear I heard him double-check that the door locked behind him. The silence from his direction had a texture now. "Someone who didn't want to be identified and someone who was raised to check the locks," he said. "Probably." She glanced at him again. He was looking at his file, but the file was at the wrong angle, and she noticed. She noticed everything. "Do you think about things like that?" she said. "Small gestures. What they mean about a person." "Constantly," Declan said, quietly, and this time he was looking at her directly and not pretending he wasn't. The heating system ticked. The city glittered outside the window. "Tell her," something in him was saying. She could feel the pressure of it across the 18 inches of air between them. The way you could feel weather, the way she'd always been able to feel the thing a person was holding before they said it. He didn't tell her. He looked at her for 3 more seconds that felt like much longer than that, and then Tucker came out of his office with the particular gusty exhale of a man released from an hour-long board call, and the moment broke and scattered like something dropped on a hard floor. "Please tell me someone ordered food," Tucker said. "I would eat a chair right now." "There's Thai in the kitchen," Harper said. "I ordered around 5. "I love you," Tucker said, with total sincerity, disappearing toward the kitchen. "Declan, there's Thai." Declan stood. He looked down at her one more time. Something in his face was resolved, she thought. Or resolving in real time, like she was watching him make up his mind about something. "Thank you," he said. Just that. "Thank you." And Harper had the distinct feeling that those 2 spoken words meant so much more. He went to the kitchen. Harper stared at her monitor. She thought about handwriting on a napkin. She thought about the lock engaging twice. She thought, oh. Pamela Hathaway had not gotten where she was by being indirect. She had gotten where she was, a seat at the right tables, a name that opened the right doors, a set of connections that had been built with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that access was a commodity and should be treated as such, by being exactly as direct as the situation required, and not a fraction more. There was no point in being obvious when subtle would do. Obvious was for people who hadn't thought it through. She had thought it through. The small-town girl was a problem. Not a significant one. Not yet. But Pamela had not become Pamela by letting small problems grow into significant ones through inattention. She had watched Declan's face when his eyes had found Harper Donovan at the cocktail event, and what she'd seen in that first unguarded half-second had been enough. Declan Mercer did not look at people the way he had looked at that woman. Pamela knew, because she had been trying for 2 years to produce that look from him herself, and the closest she'd gotten was a kind of considered appreciation that was nothing like what she'd seen cross his face in that room. What she'd seen in that room was recognition. Not like he'd met her before, like something in him knew something about her before the introduction was finished. She didn't understand it, and she didn't like it. The plant was easy. A word to Gerald at the next meeting. Gerald, who had been useful to her in 3 different situations now, and who owed her the kind of favor that didn't get discussed about certain concerns regarding Tucker's assistant. Appropriate concerns, the kind of concerns that reasonable people raised in private and then forgot about if nothing came of them. Just a suggestion of possible exposure, the kind of thing that created, at minimum, distance. The event she engineered was simpler still. She knew Declan would be at the Mercer building on a Tuesday. She knew Harper sometimes ran documents across to the main building around 11. She was waiting in the 3rd-floor corridor when it was required, talking to a colleague she'd specifically positioned herself near, and when she heard the elevator, she turned and stepped into Declan's space, in the kind of proximity that, from a distance from a corridor, looked like an intimate conversation resumed. His hand came to her arm. Not holding her, she was not going to make the mistake of characterizing it as holding just the automatic steadying gesture of a man who hadn't expected someone to step into his path. She made sure it lasted 3 seconds. She heard the elevator doors. She did not look toward them. She didn't need to. Harper walked past the corridor. Pamela talked to Declan about the Richardson event, which she knew he didn't care about, which was fine, because the conversation wasn't the point. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, watching Harper's retreating figure, and watched the thing cross his face when he clearly couldn't tell what Harper had seen. She left the conversation 2 minutes later with a flawless smile and the quiet satisfaction of a small, precise action. She was not trying to destroy anything. She was simply managing a situation. For now. Harper had been in the corridor to drop off a signed contract to the third-floor receptionist. That was all. She had come out of the elevator and looked up and seen, at the far end of the corridor, Pamela Hathaway with her hand on Declan's arm and Declan's head bent toward her in the particular way of someone in a private conversation. She had kept walking. She had delivered the contract. She had taken the elevator back up. She was not naive. She knew what exes were. She knew what complicated looked like. She also knew, with the same quiet certainty she had about most things, that something about that scene had been arranged, not staged exactly, but calibrated in a way that felt too composed to be accidental. The angle. The timing. The way Pamela had not moved away even though there was clearly room. But knowing something was arranged was not the same as knowing why, and not knowing why was unsettling. The wounded part of her, the part that had watched Kevin's face change slowly over 3 years and had kept telling herself she was imagining it, that part said, "Pull back. Give this space. You've been wrong about men before, and it cost you considerably." She listened to that part. She was professional and pleasant and warm and entirely her normal self for the rest of the week, except that she started piling files on the chair beside her desk to keep Declan from sitting here, and she stopped letting the conversations run past what the work required, and she kept her smiles at precisely the right temperature for the situation. She noticed him notice. She noticed his expression doing the thing where it didn't quite show her what it was doing, and she noticed that the not showing was more effort than usual, and she noticed that he stayed later on Thursday anyway, working at Tucker's conference table on a project that she was fairly certain didn't need to happen in this building. She noticed all of it. She went home anyway. She took the napkin out of the nightstand drawer, looked at it for 30 seconds. Put it back. Declan had dealt with difficult negotiations for most of his professional life. He had sat across the table from people whose interest was not alignment, whose apparent cooperation was a form of leverage, who smiled and agreed and were planning things he hadn't seen yet. He was good at this. He had a feel for the room. He did not have a feel for this. Harper had not done anything he could point to. She was pleasant and efficient, and she smiled when she saw him and answered his questions fully. Everything was completely fine. And yet something had shifted, sometime around Tuesday of the previous week, and he couldn't locate it, which was the specific kind of thing that drove him quietly insane. He was not accustomed to operating without information. He had replayed the corridor encounter with Pamela approximately 6 times before arriving at the conclusion he should have reached in 30 seconds. Harper had come out of the elevator. She'd seen it. She hadn't seen it for what it was. An ambush, a performance, Pamela being exactly what she was. Because he hadn't told her what Pamela was. Because he hadn't told her anything. Because he had been playing this whole thing so carefully and with such discipline that he had failed to give her the basic information required to interpret what she'd witnessed. He had done the thing he'd done with Pamela, not in substance, in structure. He had withheld information. He had managed the situation. He had decided what she needed to know and when, and in doing so he had left her vulnerable to exactly the kind of thing he should have protected her from. He went to Tucker's office on a Tuesday morning, on a Wednesday, on a Thursday. He found reasons. "There's coffee in the kitchen if you want it," Harper said, on Thursday, from her desk, without looking up. "The actual coffee. I ordered it an hour ago." "I know where the coffee is." "Then why are you standing in the doorway?" "I have a question about the Kessler payment schedule. I sent you a summary on Monday." "I have a follow-up question." She looked up. The blue eyes were steady and professional, and he hated, specifically, the professionalism. He had become accustomed to the other thing, the thing that wasn't professional, the slight warmth at the edge of her attention when she looked at him, and its absence was a cold. He noticed the way you noticed a draft from a window you hadn't known was open until it wasn't. "What's the follow-up question?" she said. He had not prepared a follow-up question. I'll email it, he said. He went and got the coffee. Tucker appeared in the kitchen doorway 4 seconds later with the expression of a man who had been watching that interaction from across the hall. You know, Tucker said, you could just talk to her. I was just talking to her. You could talk to her like a person. I talked to her like a person. Tucker got himself a coffee mug. Filled it. Turned around and leaned against the counter with the patient expression of a younger brother who had been waiting his entire life to hold the informational high ground. She saw you with Pamela in the corridor last week. Declan said nothing. I don't know what Pamela said or did, but I know what Pamela does. Tucker wrapped both hands around his mug. And I know Harper. And I know what it looks like when someone's protecting themselves. From the other room, the sound of Harper's keyboard. Steady, efficient, completely unbothered by them. I'm handling it, Declan said. You're managing it, Tucker corrected. There's a difference. You manage situations. You handle spreadsheets and acquisitions and board members. You don't manage Harper. She'll notice, and it won't go the way you think it will. Declan looked at his brother. Tucker, who was somehow almost never wrong about people, even though his method was essentially just warmth and attention and a lack of any self-protective strategy whatsoever. Tucker, who had figured out in 2 weeks what it had taken Declan 2 years to learn about Pamela. I know, Declan said, so talk to her. Not about Kessler. I'm working up to it. Work faster, Tucker said pleasantly. The quarterly review is in 3 weeks, and Pamela's going to be at the Richardson event, and I'd prefer not to spend February watching you two be professionally courteous at each other. I lived through that with the Chicago office restructure, and it aged me. Declan finished his coffee, put the mug in the sink, went back through Tucker's office toward the door. He stopped at Harper's desk. She looked up. The follow-up question, he said, is not actually about the Kessler files. Something shifted in the blue eyes. Still careful, not closed. I know, she said. He had expected her to ask what it was about. She didn't. She waited, and the waiting was so characteristically, infuriatingly her that he almost said it, almost gave her the thing he hadn't given her yet. But Tucker's phone rang, and the moment divided itself, and he said, I'll come by Monday. And she nodded and went back to her screen. He walked to the elevator and stood in it, thinking about blue eyes with considerably more heat than was strictly convenient for a man with a board meeting in 45 minutes. February arrived in St. Paul the way February always did, without apology. The city did not get softer in February. It got, if anything, more committed to its chosen theme, as though January had been the opening act and February was the main event. The part where winter looked you directly in the eye and said, You thought that was cold? Cute. Harper had upgraded her gloves. She had also purchased heated insoles for her boots, which had prompted a phone call from her mother in Millbrook that lasted 45 minutes, and included the phrase, Sweetheart, I think you've gone native. She had gone native. She was not bothered by this. What she was bothered by, quietly, controllably, in the specific way that she was bothered by things she could not yet explain to herself, was a feeling that had been building since November and which had intensified in recent weeks into something with actual edges. Something about Pamela Hathaway. Not jealousy, she was clear on that. She was almost aggressively clear on that. It was something else. Something that had started as a vague wrongness and was now beginning to have a shape. She had been assembling it without meaning to. The way you assembled a puzzle you hadn't decided to work, piece by piece, until one afternoon you looked down and found a picture. The way Pamela spoke at company events, never without purpose, always with an angle. The way she positioned herself in relation to the board members, which was not the way of someone catching up with old acquaintances, but the way of someone maintaining assets. The way she spoke about Declan, not like someone who had loved him and lost him, but like someone who had a long-term plan that had experienced a temporary setback. Harper had been putting these pieces into a place she couldn't name yet. And then, on a Tuesday in the second week of February, she was driving home from the office and the radio was doing something she wasn't listening to, and she was thinking about the conversation she'd had with Declan in the office the week before, the one about the wrong number, the one where he had gone very still, in a way she had filed and not yet opened, and her mind made a lateral move. A drunk man in her front seat, sandy brown hair, brown eyes, unfocused, but somehow still the most watchful eyes she'd been near. A voice telling her about a girlfriend who had used him to get company information, about missing the little things. about someone in his position not being able to afford that. Someone in his position. She stopped at a red light. Tucker. His brother. Tucker, who lived 15 minutes away and hadn't been seen in 3 months. Tucker Mercer, who was her boss, whose brother was named Declan. The phone number. 1 digit off. Tucker's corporate-issued phone. 1 digit off. From a corporate-issued phone belonging to someone who would have the same carrier, the same block of numbers. She sat at the red light for so long the car behind her tapped its horn. She drove the rest of the way home on a kind of autopilot, her mind doing the extremely inconvenient work of fitting pieces together that had been in her possession for weeks, and which she had apparently been refusing, on some level, to look at directly. Declan Mercer, president of international operations, ex-girlfriend who had used him for company access, brother named Tucker, phone number 1 digit off from Tucker's corporate line. He had been in her apartment, she had put her grandmother's blanket on him, she had left him aspirin and water. He had walked into Tucker's office 6 weeks later and recognized her. She was certain of that now, with a certainty that was almost physical, and had said nothing. Had smiled that careful, neutral smile, had shaken her hand, had spent the intervening weeks engineering proximity. Had sat beside her desk in Tucker's chair for hours, asking about Kessler. Had walked her to her car and put his coat on her shoulders. Had gone very still when she told him about the wrong number story. She sat in her parked car outside her building for a long moment. Then she went upstairs, made tea she didn't drink, and sat on the couch where he had slept, and thought about a man who had been a stranger and was now not a stranger and had known it for weeks while she hadn't. She thought about the aspirin. She thought about the lock. She thought about Pamela in the corridor, timed so precisely. She thought, he should have told me. He should have told me the minute he walked through that door. And then she thought, with her particular talent for the inconvenient truth, but you would have run. You know you would have. She did not run now. She sat on the couch. She was not ready to do anything with this information yet, but she was done pretending she didn't have it. She went to the nightstand drawer. Thank you. She read it twice and put it back. The Richardson Valentine's Gala was, as Tucker described it, our most important annual fundraiser, and also, let's be honest, a prolonged excuse for the board to dress up and feel good about themselves. He had said this while straightening his tie in the reflection of his office window, which Harper had observed and declined to comment on. He looked very nice. She was not going to tell him that, because he already knew. It's for the Children's Hospital, he added, as though she hadn't been managing the sponsorship correspondence for 6 weeks. So it's also for the children. The children will be relieved to hear you remembered. Wear something, he started. Tucker. Right, none of my business. She wore the burgundy dress. It was not the practical choice. It was the choice she had made in a boutique on a Saturday in November for no reason she could name at the time, a deep wine-red floor length with a neckline that was elegant rather than daring and a silhouette that had made the woman in the boutique say, "Oh, that's yours," with the authority of someone who knew. Harper had bought it and gone home and put it at the back of her closet, because she had not yet had an occasion and she had not wanted to want an occasion. The Wyndham Ballroom was everything the Mercer Industries quarterly cocktail hour was not. The Valentine's theme was present but restrained. Deep red roses at the centers of the tables, candlelight, a string quartet in the corner doing quiet, capable work. The kind of event that wanted you to feel the money, but gracefully. Harper had been to exactly nothing like this in Millbrook, and had been to exactly 2 things like this in 4 months in St. Paul, which meant she was still calibrating, but she had learned enough to know that the calibration was going well. Tucker found her at the champagne table within 3 minutes of arrival. He looked at her, then looked again, in a way that was brotherly and transparently gratifying. "You look," he started. "If you say, nice again. I'm putting the wrong date on your March filing." "Exceptional," he finished. "I was going to say exceptional. Write that down." She took her champagne. She looked out at the room. She was not looking for anyone specific. She found him in approximately 11 seconds. Declan was across the ballroom in a black suit that was different from his work suits in ways that required close attention to identify the cut, the fabric, the absence of a tie replaced by a collar that he'd left open by exactly 1 button. He was talking to a man from the board, and he was doing the thing that she now knew was his most functional social skill, giving the man his complete and total presence so that the man felt like the most significant person in the room. And then he looked up. She had prepared for this, she thought. She had told herself several sensible things about the evening, about professional context, about the fact that she had not yet decided what to do with the information she'd been sitting with for a week. She had been reasonably confident in these preparations. The preparations did not account for the way Declan Mercer looked at her from across a ballroom in candlelight. He excused himself from the board member. She watched him do it, seamlessly, warmly, with a handshake that closed the conversation so naturally the man probably didn't notice Declan was already moving. He moved toward her with the same unhurried authority that had rearranged rooms around him from the day she'd met him, and Tucker made a small sound beside her that she could only describe as gleeful and was too dignified to be appropriate. "Tucker," Declan said when he arrived, then Harper. Just her name, just those 2 syllables. The way he said them had enough weight in them to make a person want to sit down. "You look very well," he said. It was not what his eyes were saying. His eyes were saying something considerably more than very well, and she was aware of it with her whole skin. "Thank you. You look exceptional," Tucker offered. "I was going to say professional," Harper said. "Sure you were," Tucker said into his champagne. The evening moved the way these evenings did. Introductions, conversation, the strategic circulation that events like this required. Tucker introduced her to people she needed to know, and steered her away from people she didn't. Pamela was there. Of course she was, in a silver gown that had been designed for maximum effect and was achieving it. Harper watched her work the room with the same professional interest she would have given any skilled operator, which was to say, attention, information, no judgment. The string quartet transitioned to something slower around 9 o'clock. Declan appeared at her left shoulder. "Dance with me," he said. Not a question, quite. Not a command. Something in between that left her room to refuse but didn't expect her to. She turned to look at him. His expression was different tonight. Less managed, she thought. Something had moved closer to the surface. "All right," she said. He led her to the floor, and she had danced with men before, obviously. She had been married for 3 years, and had slow danced at approximately every wedding she'd attended in Millbrook, which was considerable, because Millbrook was a small town, and everyone got married. None of that was useful precedent information for this. He was good at this. Of course he was. His hand settled at her waist like it had made a decision, and his other hand held hers with a light pressure that was steady without being constraining, and they moved, and she was aware of every point of contact between them with a specificity that she found deeply inconvenient given the number of people in the room. "You've been thinking," he said, after a moment, not a question. "I'm always thinking about something specific. For the last week." He turned them gently. "I noticed. You notice things," she said. "Not always enough of them." He said it quietly. Just for her. "Not soon enough." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the most direct expression she had seen from him. Not the composed neutrality, not the professional mask. Just him. Just his face, with whatever he was carrying in it. "Declan," she said. "I know," he said. "You know what? That there's something I should have told you." The music moved them. The room moved around them. She was aware of nothing in it except the 6 inches of candlelit air between his face and hers. "After the gala," he said. "I want to tell you something. After this." She held his gaze. "All right." Something in him settled, visibly, like a breath taken and held and finally released. They danced the rest of the song in a silence that was full of everything that hadn't been said yet. And Harper's heart was doing something she'd specifically told it not to, and the candlelight was very warm, and his hand was at her waist. She had almost convinced herself that this was fine and manageable, and that she was fully in control of the situation. Then Pamela cut through the edge of the dance floor, and for just 1 second Harper saw her clearly. Not the polished surface, not the calculated smile, just the look she directed at the 2 of them before the mask came down. It was cold and assessing and held something that Harper recognized with a precision that went straight to her sternum. It was the look of someone counting on an outcome, and discovering the outcome might not be arriving on schedule. Harper filed it. The song ended. Outside, the parking structure was quiet and cold and lit by the blue-white of overhead fluorescence that made the whole space feel like a pause between one thing and another. Their breath came in small white clouds, their footsteps were loud. Her car was on level 2. He walked with her. Of course he did. She had stopped being surprised by the of-courseness of his small chivalries and had started being ambushed by them instead, which was worse. And when they reached her car, she turned and he was close, closer than the parking structure required, and the event was behind them, and it was just this. "You wanted to tell me something," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I do. I want to tell you the right way." "Is there a wrong way?" "I seem to have found one," he said, with a self-awareness that was so unexpectedly honest it stole about 3 inches of distance from the air between them. She said, "I think I already know." His eyes changed. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated. "How long?" he asked. "A week." She held his gaze. 1 digit off, Tucker's corporate number, and mine. He absorbed this. His jaw worked slightly, and she saw the flash of something. Not guilt, exactly. The specific expression of a man who understood that he had made a decision that had had a cost he hadn't intended to charge. "Harper, I know why you didn't say anything," she said. I understand the why." She stopped, because the next part was harder. "But I need you to understand that I have reasons for being careful. I have history with not being told things, with filling in gaps myself and being wrong." She looked at him steadily. "I need to not be managed, Declan. I need to be told the thing." He stepped closer. Not crowding, he didn't crowd, but into the radius that changed the quality of the air. "The thing," he said quietly, "is that I came through Tucker's door and saw you sitting at that desk, and it was the first time in my life I've been genuinely grateful for a wrong number." The fluorescence hummed above them. The cold pressed in from the open end of the structure. "That's a very good thing," Harper said, and her voice was slightly less steady than she'd planned. "I'm not finished." "I noticed." He reached up, slowly, giving her every opportunity not to want this, and tucked a strand of hair back from her face where the cold had pushed it, and his fingers stayed a moment at her jaw, and the touch was so deliberate and so gentle that it moved through her like a cord. "I should have told you immediately," he said. "I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth is, I was waiting to figure out how not to lose it." His thumb moved fractionally at her cheek. "This thing. Whatever this is, I wasn't ready to hand it to you and let you decide before I understood it myself." "And now?" she said, very quietly. "Now I understand it," he said. "Completely." He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that was certain of itself. Warm and unhurried and thorough in the way of someone who had been thinking about this for a while and was going to do it correctly. His hand moved from her jaw to the back of her head, and the cold of the parking structure was nowhere near them, and she kissed him back with everything she'd been not admitting to herself for weeks. When they broke apart, she was aware of his heartbeat at her palm where her hand had come to rest on his chest, and it was not as steady as his face. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. A car pulled up 1 level below them, headlights sweeping. The world remembered itself. He walked her to her door, opened it, waited while she got in, held the door for exactly the right amount of time. "Get home safe," he said. "Text me when you do." "You don't have my number," she said. He smiled. The real one, the one that was not professional or composed, the one she had seen exactly twice, and which was frankly unfair. "No, but you have a company phone with a number that is 1 digit off from Tucker's." She laughed. She hadn't meant to, but there it was. He closed her car door. She watched him in the rearview mirror as she pulled out of the space, standing in the cold in his excellent suit, watching her go. She drove 2 blocks and texted him. "I'm safely 2 blocks away." His reply came back in 30 seconds. "Good. I know, I'm watching the street." She drove home smiling in a way that her face had apparently made a unilateral decision about. She did not check the nightstand drawer. She didn't need to. Pamela had seen it. Not all of it. She had not been in the parking structure, but she had seen the way Harper had looked when she and Declan were dancing, and she had seen Declan's face. And she had been in this business long enough to know what chemistry looked like on 2 people who had been circling each other for 6 weeks. The small-scale management was done. She went home that night and made a phone call. The documentation was not difficult to assemble. Pamela had a talent for making things look precisely as she needed them to look, which was a skill that had served her well in a variety of contexts. A forwarded email chain, real emails, but selectively curated. A document access log with a timestamp that could be read two ways if you weren't looking closely. A supplier contact in Harper's sent folder, placed there not by Harper, presented as though placed there by Harper, to a company that appeared, if you ran it 2 steps back, to have a relationship with a Mercer competitor. It took her 4 days. Gerald brought it to the board. Harper got the call from HR on a Tuesday morning. A standard audit review, nothing to be concerned about, just some questions regarding her file access over the last 6 weeks. The voice was pleasant and professional and said things like routine review and compliance procedure, and Harper sat at her desk after hanging up and felt the specific cold of something aimed at you that had been traveling for a while. She went into Tucker's office and closed the door. "Tucker," she said, "I need to tell you something," she told him. All of it. The HR call, the file access in question, the Kessler documents she had been handling, the sequence of events as she knew them. She was clear and organized, which was how she handled things that frightened her. Tucker listened without interrupting, which was not like him, which told her how seriously he was taking it. When she finished, he was quiet for 5 seconds. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He stood up. He was not breezy right now, not the Tucker who made wild commentary and forgot meetings. This was the other Tucker, the one she caught occasional glimpses of, the one who had, after all, built and run a Mercer subsidiary for 6 years. "I'm calling legal." "Don't talk to anyone before legal." "Tucker, you didn't do this, Harper." He said it with a flat, immediate certainty. "I know my files. I know my office. I know you." He picked up his phone. "We're going to take this apart, and I'm going to be very irritating about it, and whoever did this is going to have a bad month." She looked at him. He was already dialing. His jaw was set in a way she'd seen twice, and which communicated that Tucker Mercer's considerable charm was not currently available, and in its place was something considerably less comfortable. She sat down in the spare chair. Across town, Declan was in a board meeting. She knew, because she had managed his schedule for the last 3 weeks on Tucker's behalf. She also knew his phone was silenced in board meetings because he had told her this. Had told her the day after the gala, in a conversation that had started as professional and ended up lasting 45 minutes and had involved exactly zero business. He did not know yet. The board was going to tell him before she could. She thought about what Tucker had said about Pamela, not the details, which Tucker had always kept vague, but the shape of it, about Declan and missed things. About how not seeing something coming was, for Declan, the specific injury. She thought about a drunk man in her car saying someone in my position cannot miss the little things. And she thought he's going to get this the wrong way. And she thought this is the test, not her test, his. The board meeting broke at noon. Gerald got to Declan before the doors had fully opened, which told Declan it was either very good news or the kind of bad news that couldn't wait for coffee. Gerald's expression confirmed the second option. He listened to Gerald for 4 minutes. He asked 3 questions. He said, "I'll review the documentation." He went back to his office and closed the door and sat down and had a very brief and extremely private moment that would never be discussed. It was the moment that happened when the architecture of a thing you thought you were sure about showed you a crack you hadn't seen. It lasted approximately 6 seconds. Because here was the thing. He knew Harper Donovan. He had known her in the way that mattered before he had known anything factual about her. Had known it at 2 a.m. outside a bar, in a car that smelled of something clean and warm, while a stranger asked him patiently for an address he couldn't provide. He had known it in the careful way she managed Tucker's chaos, and in the questions she asked and the ones she didn't, and in her face, when he had told her about the lock on the door and watched her eyes soften with an understanding she hadn't explained. He had known it in the parking structure, with her hand on his chest and her heart doing things he could feel through a $300 shirt. He called Tucker. "She already told me," Tucker said, before Declan got a word out. "I've got legal on it. I want the actual documentation, not Gerald's summary. I'm pulling it now." "Declan." Tucker's voice changed. "What's your read?" A pause. "My read," Declan said, "is that this has the same architecture as the last time." Tucker was quiet for a moment. "Pamela, the email chain is real, but curated. The access log timestamp is ambiguous. The supplier contact in her sent folder, I want to see the metadata." He had been looking at it while they talked. "This was assembled, Tucker. This didn't emerge organically. I know. I should have. Don't, Tucker said. Not right now. Do the job first. The documentation took him 3 hours. He was thorough in the way he was thorough about everything, which was to say, completely, without mercy for comfortable assumptions, including the ones that would have made the process easier. He found the metadata. He found the timestamp discrepancy. He found, in the supplier contact record, a small procedural error that no one who actually worked in Harper's role would have made, but that someone assembling a simulation of that role would have made, because they hadn't thought to ask how these things actually worked. He called legal. He called Gerald, and the conversation was brief and not pleasant for Gerald. He went to Tucker's office. Harper was at her desk. She looked up when he came in. Just met his eyes, quiet and steady. And he thought about the 6 seconds in his office and about the fact that she had known, probably, that this was the moment he would either be the version of himself he wanted to be or the version that Pamela had been counting on. The documentation is fabricated, he said. I have the evidence for HR's review. This is being closed. She held his gaze. Thank you. Don't thank me. This should not have... He stopped. Started again. I should have moved faster on Pamela. I knew what she was capable of. I had the evidence of it. And I didn't. He was not good at this. The personal accountability out loud, the acknowledgement of the specific failure. I let you be in the path of something I should have closed off months ago. Tucker's office door was open, and Tucker was extremely occupied with his computer screen in the way of someone who was reading the same paragraph for the 4th time. Declan? Harper said. I'm not finished. I know, she said, but I am. She said it quietly, without anger. I'm not interested in the accounting of blame. I'm interested in what happens now. He looked at her. What would you like to happen now? A beat. Those blue eyes, very direct. I'd like to have a conversation that has nothing to do with this building, and nothing to do with work, and nothing to do with any of the layers of complication we've been navigating for the last 6 weeks. She paused. And I'd like it to start with you telling me the whole thing, from the beginning. Because I have pieces of it, and I need the parts you have, and I'm not willing to build this on a foundation with gaps in it. From the other office, the sound of Tucker's chair being very still. Tonight? Declan said. Tonight, she said. He nodded. He went back to his office to make 3 phone calls and file 2 reports and do all the things that needed doing before he could do the most important thing. Tucker appeared in Harper's doorway approximately 35 seconds later. You're good at this, he said. At what? At him. He said it like it surprised him, which, given Tucker's general conviction that his brother was impossible, was the highest compliment available. Go back to work, Tucker. Gladly. He disappeared, and she heard him humming as he went, insufferably. Tucker told her the rest of it on a Wednesday. He did it with the casualness of a man who had been waiting for the right moment for several weeks and had decided that the right moment was now, while Harper was eating lunch at her desk and would have limited ability to escape. So, he said, settling into the spare chair with his own lunch and the expression of a man about to tell a story he found very personally satisfying. Can I tell you something? Do I have a choice? Not really. He opened his container. The morning after the shenanigans incident, which I'm calling the shenanigans incident for the historical record, Declan called me. Harper stopped chewing. He told me the whole thing. Wrong number, bar, the car, woke up in a stranger's apartment. Tucker was trying to be casual. He was not succeeding. I said, okay, and? He said the woman had blue eyes. I said I'm sure she did, and? He said she'd left aspirin in water and covered him with a blanket. Harper said nothing. He spent 20 minutes telling me about the aspirin, Tucker said. 20 minutes, Harper. Declan, who can close a 9-figure acquisition in 45 minutes, spent 20 minutes on a glass of water and 2 aspirin that a stranger left on a table. She set down her fork. He said... Tucker paused, and she got the sense he was not paraphrasing, that he had kept the exact words. I don't know how someone like that makes it in this city. I want to know how she makes it in this city. Someone has to make sure she's all right. The February light came through the window. Outside, St. Paul went about its business. He had no idea you worked for me. I had no idea it was you, Tucker continued. All he had was the memory of a blue-eyed woman and a neighborhood from the building. And then he walked through that door weeks later. "What did he do?" she asked. "When he saw me." "What did he actually do?" Tucker smiled, stopped breathing for about 2 seconds. Which, for Declan, is the emotional equivalent of falling down a flight of stairs. He tilted his head. Then he shook your hand and said, "Declan Mercer," like it was absolutely the most normal thing in the world. And came into my office and I asked him how he was and he said fine. "He said fine," she repeated. "He said fine." I have never heard a man say fine, with that much happening behind his eyes in my life, and I've been watching him say fine at things since I was 8 years old. Tucker pointed at her with his fork. "You did that?" To him. With 2 aspirin and a blanket. Before you'd even spoken to him in daylight. Harper looked at the window for a long moment. She thought about a man who had learned not to show his hand, who had built an entire professional identity around not showing his hand, sitting in his brother's office saying fine. About a lock checked twice in the dark. About a coat placed on her shoulders without asking, without announcement, without any expectation of credit. The small things. Someone in my position cannot miss the small things. He hadn't missed them. Not once. Not with her. Every small thing she had noticed. The corner of her desk, the name she'd mentioned once that he'd remembered. The coffee, the walk to her car, the way he'd gone still when she told the wrong number story. Had not been management. It had been attention. The real kind. The kind that cost something. "Tucker?" she said. "Yeah?" "You're not as oblivious as you seem." "I know," he said, going back to his lunch. "It's a very useful quality." That evening, the dinner that wasn't about work, and wasn't about Kessler, and wasn't about any of the complications that had gathered around them like weather. That dinner was quiet and easy, and ran 3 hours without either of them noticing it had. She asked him to tell her from the beginning. He did. He told her about shenanigans and the borrowed phone, and the wall outside and the cold and the car. He told her about waking up and the aspirin, and when he got to that part his voice changed in a way that corroborated everything Tucker had said, and made her throat do something she hadn't planned on. He told her about the napkin and the lock and the doorman's face. He told her about the cab ride home and telling himself the odds. "And then?" she said. And then Tucker's door opened. She looked at him across the table. Candlelight again. Smaller candles, smaller table, quieter restaurant. No room full of board members. "What did you feel?" she asked. "When you saw me?" He was quiet for a moment. She had learned this about him. That his silences were not deflection but consideration. The pause of a man who was not going to answer until the answer was right. "Like something I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking," he said, and then immediately terrified that I'd do something to lose it before I understood what it was. She let that land. "You should have told me," she said. "Not because I needed you to. I might have run, honestly, if you'd led with it. But because keeping it changed the shape of things between us, and I was reading the shape wrong. I know. I'm sorry. I know you are." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to not make that kind of decision for me again, even when it's protective. I can handle information, Declan. What I can't handle is gaps." "No more gaps," he said. He said it simply and directly, the way he said things when he meant them without qualification. She believed him. That was the thing. She simply, cleanly believed him. Which was new. Which was the most quietly frightening thing that had happened to her in 4 months in this city. He paid the bill before she reached for her purse, which she had expected. He helped her into her coat, which she had expected. He held the door, and walked to her left, and was going to walk her to her car, and all of these things had stopped being gestures she catalogued, and had become simply the texture of being near him. Outside the restaurant, the night air was cold but the wind had dropped, and the city was its own illuminated, enormous, improbable self. "Come up," she said. "I'll make tea, or coffee, or we can sit on the couch." A pause. The particular quality of his attention focused on her like a lens. "The couch I already know," he said. She looked up at him. Different terms this time. His eyes went warm in the streetlight. Significantly. They went up. It started with tea. She made it because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the apartment felt smaller with him in it, not in a bad way, just the sense of all that focused presence occupying the same space where she lived, filling in corners she hadn't known were empty. He sat at the kitchen counter and watched her move around the kitchen with the same quality of attention he gave everything, and she was aware of it the way you were aware of sunlight through a window, warm and pointed and a little relentless. She set his cup in front of him. Their hands were close. "Tea," she said, somewhat unnecessarily. "Yes." He was looking at her, not at the tea. "Harper. I'm going to be very clear about something." "Okay. I'm not here for the tea." She looked up at him. "I know." He stood, and she had a half-second in which to register his full height and the fact that the kitchen was not large, and then he was there, in her space, one hand braced against the counter on either side of her, and the air between them had changed temperature in approximately 1 second. He did not rush it. His forehead came to rest against hers, and they stayed there for a moment, breathing the same air, his hands warm on the counter and his face close and his eyes open and on hers. "I've thought about this," he said quietly, "every day for 2 months." "I know," she said. "So have I." Admitting it, out loud, to his face, was the most honest she'd been in a long time, and the honesty felt like something opening. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete attention and no hurry, and the absolute conviction of a man who had decided. She kissed him back the way she did everything, fully, with her whole self, which was the only way she knew how to do things even when it scared her, and it scared her now, and she did it anyway. His hands moved from the counter to her waist, and she stepped into him, and his arms came around her with a certainty that felt like being found, like the arrival of something that had been in transit for a long time. She felt the warmth of his chest through the fabric of his shirt, and the steadiness of his hands, and the breath of him against her mouth, and the tea went cold, and the kitchen light was soft, and the city went on outside without either of them. At some point, the kitchen became the living room, and the living room became the couch. Her grandmother's couch, the oatmeal-colored one, the same one. And he looked at it when they arrived, and then looked at her with a question in his face that had nothing to do with words. "Different terms," she reminded him. "I remember," he said. They stayed close on the couch, his arm around her, her head against his shoulder, talking for a while about nothing important. The city moved outside the window. The night deepened. The heating system ticked. She was aware of every place they were touching. She was aware of the particular quality of his breathing, and the weight of his arm, and the warmth that emanated from him, that was specific and unmistakable, and hers, she understood, if she wanted it. She wanted it. "Stay," she said. Not a question. The thing she'd worked up to for approximately 45 minutes, delivered at last, without strategy or protection or any of the distance she'd been maintaining for a year. He turned his head and looked at her, and his face did the thing that was not the mask and not the controlled neutrality, but the actual Declan, the one under all of it, and he said, "I was hoping you'd say that." The bedroom was dark, and the city glittered through the window, and none of what happened next was rushed or careful or managed by either of them. His hands were warm on her skin, and his mouth found the line of her throat, and she arched into him with a soft sound that she hadn't planned on making, and that he received with a thorough attention that made it clear he intended to catalog every sound she made and pay them all back with interest. He was unhurried in the way she was already learning was his nature, present and focused and entirely committed to the thing in front of him, and she understood, in the dark and warmth of it, that this was what it looked like when Declan Mercer gave something his full attention. His mouth found her collarbone, and she wound her fingers into his hair, and the slow accumulation of heat between them became something with no patience left in it, and when they finally arrived at the moment that had been building since a parking lot outside Shenanigans in January, it felt like recognition, like remembering something she hadn't known she'd known. Afterward, they lay in the quiet, and the streetlight came through the window, and his hand moved in slow strokes along her spine, and she thought, oh, so this is what this is supposed to feel like. She hadn't known? She had thought she'd known, and she hadn't. "Hey," he said, very quietly. "Hey," she said. His arm tightened fractionally. She felt his lips against her hair. She slept better than she had since moving to this city, and did not dream, and the night was long and warm, and his. Let's talk about Pamela for a moment, because she deserves a conclusion, even if it is a brief one. The evidence Declan pulled from the metadata was conclusive, and, once legal got involved, and the board reviewed the full chain, professionally damaging in a way that could not be managed or minimized. Gerald, who had been the conduit, was quietly reevaluated with respect to his board position. Pamela herself lost 3 of the connections she'd been maintaining most carefully, the ones she'd built through Mercer Industries, in the span of 2 weeks. She was not charged with anything, because the corporate espionage case from the previous year had been settled, and the new incident, while damaging to Harper's reputation in a way that had been fully corrected, did not constitute a criminal act. This was the frustrating thing about people who were very good at what they did. They were also generally very good at staying just on the right side of the line. Pamela Hathaway left St. Paul for a position in New York in early March, which everyone agreed was best for all parties, and which Tucker described as, quote, the universe having a competent day. Harper thought about saying something generous about Pamela. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds, and then decided she didn't have to, because she was not required to be generous about everything, and this was one of the small things she had learned about herself in 4 months, in a city where no one knew her name. The fresh start had not made her a different person. It had made her more clearly herself. She was fine with that. The weeks between the gala and the end of February had a texture that was new to her. It was not the texture of the early part of the story, which had been the texture of a woman being careful, keeping her perimeter, managing her distance, maintaining the pleasant and competent warmth that let people in exactly as far as she had decided, and no further. It was the texture of a woman who had decided to stop managing her perimeter for one specific person, and was discovering that the thing she'd been protecting herself from was, in fact, the thing she wanted. This was irritating and wonderful in approximately equal measure. She was trying to find the right word for what Declan was in the ordinary days, the ones that weren't the gala or the dinner, or the conversation in the parking structure. He was consistent. That was the word. Consistently chivalrous, consistently attentive, consistently himself, with no gap between the version of him that showed up in Tucker's office and the version that showed up at her door on a Saturday morning with good coffee, and the particular unhurried quality of a man who was not going anywhere. She had not been prepared for the consistency. She had expected, based on evidence from her own history, that things which were very good at the beginning had a tendency to become less clear over time. She had been waiting, without quite knowing she was waiting, for the thing to change. It didn't change. It accumulated. Tucker, for his part, had achieved a state of satisfaction that he was trying to be professional about and failing at entirely. He had taken to humming. He brought donuts to the office on Fridays. He had told Harper once, with the sincerity of a man making an official statement, "I just want you to know I take full credit for this," which she had declined to confirm or deny, which he had taken as confirmation. March came. St. Paul, in March, began to give you reasons to believe in it. Not warmth, not yet, but light. More light. Earlier in the morning, later in the evening, the city shifting fractionally towards something gentler. Harper drove to work and noticed it. The way the sky had a different quality at 7 a.m. than it had in January, and she thought, "I live here. This is mine." That thought still surprised her, which was its own kind of good. The night it happened was not a dramatic night. That was the thing she wanted to make clear, in the way of a narrator who has been telling you this story and has opinions about how it should land. It was not a night with weather or crisis, or any of the catalysts that stories often use to push people toward the moment they've been building toward. It was a Thursday. She had worked late. Tucker had left at 5 for an event. She had finished the quarterly summary, turned off her monitor, gathered her things. She had gotten home at 8. She had eaten leftover soup from Tuesday. She had taken a bath and read 40 pages of the novel on her nightstand and gone to sleep. At 2:11 a.m., her doorbell rang. Not her phone, her actual doorbell, which meant Harold had sent someone up, which meant it was someone Harold knew or someone Harold had evaluated and found acceptable. Harold's evaluations were, in Harper's experience, reliable. She put on her robe. She turned on the hall light. She opened the door. Declan was standing in her doorway. He was not in the excellent suit. He was in jeans and a coat, a better coat than the one from Shenanigans, she noticed, a coat that was actually adequate for the temperature, and his hair was slightly rearranged from sleep or the wind or both. He looked like a man who had woken up at 1 a.m. with a thought he needed to deliver in person, and had acted on it before he thought too hard about it. He had clearly acted on it before he thought too hard about it. Harper looked at him. He looked at her, The hallway was quiet. "It's 2 in the morning," she said. "I know." He didn't look apologetic. He looked like a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had no regrets about it. I woke up thinking about something. At 2 in the morning. It's a recurring theme with this address, he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The apartment was warm and quiet, and the only light was the lamp in the hallway and the ambient glow of the city through the windows. He stood in the living room, in the same spot where she'd helped him out of his coat 4 months ago, where she'd shaken out her grandmother's Afghan, where she'd left water and aspirin on the little table. And he looked at the couch and then at her with an expression that was the most open she had ever seen from him. "Sit down," she said, "before you say whatever you came to say." She sat across from him, legs tucked up, robe wrapped around her, hair in the braid she slept in, entirely without ceremony. "The last time I was in this spot," he said, "I woke up and I didn't know where I was, and I didn't know who had left me water and aspirin, and I walked out and told myself I'd never find her again. And then I spent the next 3 weeks thinking about her more than I've thought about any other person in recent memory." He looked at his hands, looked up at her, and then Tucker's elevator opened. She said nothing. She was very warm under the robe, and the city was very bright through the window, and the night was entirely still. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I know how to manage things, and I know how to protect things, and I know how to make sure the right information gets to the right people at the right time. But this," he gestured between them, in a motion that was slightly helpless and entirely un-CEO-like, and she loved it. "This I don't have a system for." "I know," she said. "It turns out I don't want a system for it." She looked at him. "I woke up tonight," he said, "and you weren't there, which has become, apparently, a thing I notice. And I thought, she drove across a frozen city at 2 in the morning for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. She covered him with a blanket. She left him aspirin." He stopped. "I think I've been in love with you since before I knew your name." The words went into the quiet apartment and stayed. Harper looked at this man, this large, careful, occasionally infuriating, constitutionally chivalrous man who had checked her lock on his way out and said fine to his brother with his whole world in his eyes, and she thought about Kevin saying, "I don't think you've ever needed me." And she thought, he's wrong. Actually, I was wrong. It's not about need, it's about want. It's about choosing someone every morning, on purpose, because the world is better with them in it than without. "Declan," she said. "Yes. I drove across a frozen city at 2 in the morning for a stranger." She looked at him with steady blue eyes. "I would drive across it again." Something in him went very, very still. "For me specifically," he said, and his voice was slightly lower than usual. "For you specifically," she said, "though next time you could maybe not borrow the bartender's phone. I'm right here." He laughed. Actually laughed, the real one, not the professional version, and it transformed him completely, and she crossed the small space between them, and he caught her, both arms, and she was in his lap with her face tucked against his jaw and his arms around her, and the city blazed outside the window, and neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't anything left to say. He stayed. He checked the lock on his way in this time, not his way out, which she noticed, and which said more than 20 speeches would have. In the morning, she made actual coffee, and there were 2 mugs on the counter, and the sun came through the window and hit the plants on the sill and made them very green, and the city went about its business below them, enormous and indifferent, and full of people who would never know about wrong numbers or bartender phones or the particular kindness of aspirin left on a table. But Harper knew, and Declan knew, and Tucker, who received a very brief and intentionally uninformative text at 9 a.m. from his brother that said simply in the interest of full disclosure, "I'm at Harper's, absolutely, completely, and with great personal satisfaction," knew. He texted back, "Finally, I want full credit. Also, please tell her she's getting a raise." Declan showed it to Harper over coffee. She looked at it for a moment. "He's not wrong," she said. "About the credit or the raise?" "Both," she said. She was smiling, so was he. Outside, St. Paul was cold and bright and entirely itself, and the day was only getting started. And so, as the snow settles over St. Paul, we leave Harper and Declan in the warmth of a story that started with a wrong number and ended with a perfect fit. But before I go, we have to talk about Tucker Mercer. He's the brother we all need and the boss we'd all love to have. The man who knows that sometimes the best way to handle a situation is to simply let the heart take the lead. But here's the thing. While Tucker spent this winter making sure everyone else found their happily ever after, his own chair at the kitchen table is still a little too quiet. He spent so much time being the matchmaker that he hasn't yet found his match. Tucker's own journey is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to be in the dark when his world finally flips upside down. So if you enjoyed this journey through the frozen streets of St. Paul, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss out, because Tucker Mercer's story is coming soon, and it's going to be exceptional. Thanks for watching.